Welcome back to Haunted Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 7 deeply disturbing true stories from remote Canadian small towns. These are tales of people who ventured into the unforgiving wilderness and isolation of Canada's forgotten places and encountered something that defied explanation. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. The town of Pittock, Saskatchewan sits about 40 minutes north of Meadow Lake, tucked into a pocket of dense spruce forest that seems to swallow sound. Population fluctuates between 60 and 80 depending on the season. I inherited my uncle's property there in March of 2024, about 3 weeks after he died. The lawyer said he'd been living alone for 16 years. Maybe 17. The paperwork wasn't entirely clear. I'm Darren Holbrook, and I'd only met my uncle twice that I could remember, once at a funeral when I was 9, and once at a Christmas dinner that ended badly when he and my father got into it about something I was too young to understand. But apparently I was the only family he had left, so the cabin and the 11 acres around it became mine. My girlfriend at the time, Simone, thought I should just sell it sight unseen. She had a point. I was working 60-hour weeks as a surveyor in Calgary, and the idea of maintaining a property I'd never seen 500 kilometers away seemed insane. But something about it pulled at me. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was curiosity about the uncle I'd never known. I drove up on a Saturday in late April. The frost was finally breaking, and the highway was wet with runoff. I stopped for gas in Meadow Lake, and the attendant, an older woman with deep lines around her eyes, asked where I was headed. When I told her Pittock, she got quiet for a moment, then just said, "Drive safe." The way she said it made my stomach tighten, but I told myself I was reading into things. The cabin was worse than I'd imagined. Single story, wood siding gone gray with age, roof sagging in the middle. The windows were covered from the inside with what looked like newspaper and cardboard. I parked in the overgrown driveway and sat there for a minute, engine ticking as it cooled. The forest pressed in close on 3 sides, spruce and poplar so thick I couldn't see more than 20 feet into the trees. The front door was unlocked. Inside smelled like damp wood and something sour I couldn't place. My uncle had lived simply, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a cot in the corner with a sleeping bag still on it. No TV, a radio on the counter covered in dust. The cupboards held canned goods, most of them expired. There was a wood stove in the center of the room, and the walls around it were dark with smoke stains. What got my attention were the locks. The front door had 3 deadbolts, all installed at different heights like they'd been added over time. The 2 windows had latches, but also had brackets screwed into the frames with 2x4s leaning nearby, like he barricaded them from the inside. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, or maybe he'd had trouble with bears. I spent the first hour cleaning, trying to make the place livable enough to sleep in. I'd planned to stay the weekend, sort through his things, figure out what to do with the property. The sun was getting low, and the light coming through the windows, I'd pulled down some of the newspaper, had that golden quality that happens just before dusk. That's when I found the notebook. It was under the cot, wrapped in a plastic bag. The handwriting was tight, cramped, like he'd been trying to fit as many words as possible on each page. Most of it was mundane, notes about the weather, reminders to check the roof, a grocery list. But toward the middle the entries changed. November 3rd, heard it again last night. Closer this time, checked the doors twice. November 7th, saw movement in the trees around 4 a.m. Couldn't make out shape, too tall to be a person. November 12th, it knows I'm watching. Found marks on the door frame this morning. 3 lines, evenly spaced. The entries went on like that for pages. The dates jumped around, some from years ago, some more recent. The last entry was dated 2 days before he died. It's patient, I'll give it that. I closed the notebook and shoved it back under the cot. My hands were shaking, though I wasn't sure why. I told myself he'd been old, isolated, probably not entirely well. People living alone for that long sometimes develop delusions. It happened. I made myself a dinner of canned soup heated on the wood stove and tried not to think about the notebook. But as the light faded and the cabin grew dark, I became acutely aware of how quiet it was. No traffic sounds. No distant voices or dogs barking, just the forest and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I'd brought a camping lantern and I set it on the table, turning it to low. The windows were black now, reflecting the lantern's glow back at me. I couldn't see outside, which meant anything outside couldn't see in either. That's what I told myself. Around 10, I heard it, a sound like fingernails on wood coming from the back of the cabin. Slow, deliberate, 3 scrapes, then silence, then 3 more. I sat frozen at the table, soup forgotten, listening. The scraping stopped. I waited 5 minutes, then 10, nothing. I finally stood and moved toward the back wall where the sound had come from. There was a small window there, still covered with newspaper. I hesitated, then pulled the paper away. The window looked out onto the backyard, where the grass gave way to forest. In the faint light from the lantern, I could just make out the tree line. And standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 30 feet from the cabin, was a shape. It was tall, taller than any person, and it was still perfectly still in a way that made my throat close up. I couldn't make out details, the darkness was too complete, but I could see the outline, the way it stood. The proportions were wrong, arms too long, head tilted at an angle that made me think of a dog listening to a sound. I stepped back from the window so fast I knocked over one of the chairs. It clattered to the floor, and I dropped to my knees, heart slamming in my chest. I stayed there for what felt like an hour but was probably only a few minutes, then crawled to the window and looked again. It was closer, not by much, maybe 5 feet, but it had moved in complete silence, and it was still standing in that same unnatural stillness. I could see more details now, the way its shoulders were too wide, the way its arms hung almost to its knees. I backed away from the window and moved to the front door. All 3 deadbolts were locked. I grabbed one of the 2x4s leaning against the wall and wedged it against the door frame the way my uncle must have done. Then I did the same to the back window, jamming the board into the brackets he'd installed. The scraping started again. This time it was on the front door. 3 long, slow scrapes, like something dragging claws down the wood. Then silence. Then 3 more on the side of the cabin. Then on the back wall. It was circling. I killed the lantern and stood in the darkness, listening to it move around the cabin. The scraping never sped up, never became frantic. It was methodical, patient, like my uncle had written, testing. I don't know how long it went on. An hour, maybe more. At some point I realized I was standing in the center of the room, turning slowly to follow the sounds as they moved around the cabin. My legs were cramping, but I was afraid to move, afraid to make any sound that might let it know exactly where I was inside. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the scraping. I stood there in the dark, listening to my own breathing, waiting. Minutes passed. 5, 10. Nothing. I moved carefully to the front window and looked out. The driveway was empty. The trees were still. I checked the back window, nothing there either. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the table with the lantern on low, watching both windows. I didn't see it again, but around 4 a.m. I heard movement in the trees, branches snapping, something large moving through the underbrush, moving away from the cabin. When dawn finally came and gray light started filtering through the windows, I grabbed my keys and left. I didn't pack my things. I didn't lock the door. I just got in my truck and drove. I called a realtor from Meadow Lake and told her to list the property as is. I've never been back. The cabin sold 3 months later to a developer who plans to tear it down and build something new. I hope he does it during the day, and I hope whatever was in those woods has moved on. But I still have the notebook, and sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I read that last entry and wonder what my uncle meant. It's patient, like he knew it would outlast him, like he knew eventually it would get what it wanted. Story 2. Granton, Ontario is the kind of place you pass through on your way to somewhere else. Maybe 300 people, a gas station, a post office that's only open Tuesday through Thursday. It sits in farming country flat fields that stretch out in every direction, broken up by windbreaks and the occasional barn. I'm Emma Garrison, and I moved there in the fall of 2023 for work. I'd taken a contract position as a veterinary technician at a rural practice that served farms within a 40-kilometer radius. The pay was decent, and I needed the change. I just ended a 5-year relationship and wanted to be somewhere quiet where I could reset. I rented a farmhouse about 3 kilometers outside town. The landlord, a man named Bernard who owned the property but lived in London, told me the house had been empty for 2 years. Last tenants left pretty sudden, he said, but the place is sound. You'll like the privacy. He wasn't wrong about the privacy. The nearest neighbor was at least 1 kilometer away down a gravel road, and at night the darkness was total. No streetlights, no passing cars, just fields and sky and the wind moving through the long grass. The house was old but well maintained, 2 stories, wraparound porch, a barn out back that I never bothered to explore. The barn doors were chained shut, and Bernard said I didn't have access to it anyway. Use it for storage, he said. Nothing in there you'd need. The first few weeks were fine. I settled into a routine, work during the day, quiet evenings cooking dinner and reading. I liked the isolation more than I expected. It felt like I could breathe for the first time in years. The first strange thing happened on a Tuesday night in October. I was washing dishes after dinner, standing at the kitchen sink, when I saw movement outside the window. Just a flicker, like someone passing by quickly. I froze, soapy water dripping from my hands, and stared out into the darkness. Nothing. Just the porch light reflecting off the grass, and beyond that, blackness. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer. The fields around the house were full of them, but the movement hadn't been right. It had been too upright, too purposeful. I dried my hands and went to the front door. The porch light was on, and I could see clearly across the yard to where my car was parked. Nothing moved. I stood there for a full minute, watching, then locked the door and went back to the dishes. It happened again 3 nights later. This time I was upstairs in the bedroom, getting ready for bed when I heard footsteps on the porch. Not heavy, light, almost delicate, like someone walking carefully. I went to the window and looked down. The porch was empty, but as I watched, I saw something move near the corner of the house. A shadow separating itself from the deeper darkness, then disappearing again. My chest tightened. I grabbed my phone and almost called the police, but what would I say? I saw a shadow, I heard footsteps, but there's no one there. Instead, I turned off all the lights in the house and sat in the dark bedroom watching the yard. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Then I saw it again, a figure, pale and thin, moving across the yard toward the barn. It walked in a straight line, not hurrying, and when it reached the barn doors, it stopped. Just stood there facing the chains. I couldn't see details. The porch light didn't reach that far, and the figure was backlit by the faint starlight. But the proportions were human. It had to be a person, someone trespassing, maybe squatting in the barn. I watched until it moved again, this time walking back the way it had come, disappearing into the fields. When I couldn't see it anymore, I got into bed fully clothed and didn't sleep until the sun came up. I called Bernard the next morning and told him what I'd seen. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "You want to break the lease?" "What?" "No, should I call the police? Is someone living in the barn?" "Barn's been locked for 5 years," he said. "No one's in there." "Then what did I see?" Another pause. "I don't know, Emma, but if you want to leave, I'll let you out of the lease. No penalties." That should have been a warning. I realize that now. But I was stubborn, and I didn't want to admit I'd been scared by shadows and footsteps. So I stayed. For a week, nothing happened. I started to relax. I convinced myself I'd seen a trespasser who'd moved on, or maybe just a trick of the light. Then I found the handprints. They were on the kitchen window on the outside. I noticed them on a Sunday morning when the sun hit the glass at just the right angle. 5 prints perfectly spaced, like someone had pressed their hand against the glass and left moisture behind. But the prints were wrong. The fingers were too long, and there were too many. I counted them 3 times to be sure. 7 fingers. I scrubbed the window clean and tried not to think about it. 7 fingers. It didn't make sense. I told myself it was condensation or some weird residue that just looked like prints. But my hands were shaking as I cleaned. That night I heard the footsteps again. This time they didn't stay on the porch. They moved around the house, slow and measured, circling. I sat at the kitchen table with every light on, listening to them pass the windows one by one. When they reached the back door, they stopped. I stared at the door. It was solid wood with a small window at the top. I could see my reflection in the glass, pale and frightened. And then behind my reflection, I saw something else. A face. It was pressed against the window, looking in. The features were human but wrong, eyes too large, skin too smooth, mouth slightly open. It stared at me without blinking, and I stared back, frozen. Then it smiled, not a human smile. The mouth stretched too wide, showing too many teeth, and the expression held no warmth, no recognition. It was mimicry, like something trying to remember how a smile worked. I bolted from the kitchen, grabbed my keys and phone, and ran to my car. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't check to see if it was following. I just drove. I went to a motel in Stratford and stayed there for 3 days, calling in sick to work. On the 3rd day, Bernard called me. "You still at the house?" he asked. "No." "Good, I'm terminating the lease. I'll refund your deposit and last month's rent." "What was it?" I asked. "You know, don't you? That's why the last tenants left." He didn't answer for a long time. "I don't know what it is," he finally said, "but it's been there longer than the house. The land used to be part of a bigger farm back in the 1800s. Family that owned it abandoned it, just walked away. No one knows why." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." I never went back to the house. Bernard hired someone to pack up my things and ship them to me. When the box arrived, there was something inside that wasn't mine. A photograph, old and faded, showing a farmhouse I recognized. My farmhouse. And standing in front of it, barely visible in the overexposed sunlight, was a figure. Tall, thin, with arms that hung too long. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in pencil, "It doesn't leave." A story 3. I grew up in Caslow, British Columbia, a small town tucked against the shore of Kootenay Lake. Population around 1,000, depending on the season. It's beautiful country, mountains rising up sharp and green on all sides, the lake stretching out cold and deep. Tourists come through in the summer, but by October the town empties out and you're left with just the locals and the weather moving in. My name is Joel Pritchard, and in November of 2024, I was working for a forestry service crew doing trail maintenance in the back country. It was decent work, decent pay, and it got me outside, which was what I wanted. The crew was small, just me, my supervisor Raquel, and another guy named Owen who'd been doing this for 5 seasons. We were working on a section of trail about 15 kilometers north of town, accessible only by logging road. The trail wound through old-growth forest, cedar and hemlock, with moss so thick on the ground it muffled sound. Our job was to clear deadfall, mark erosion points, and update the trail signs. On a Thursday morning, Raquel sent me ahead to scout a section we'd be working the next day. "Just mark the major deadfalls," she said. "Take photos for the report. We'll catch up with you after lunch." I was happy to go solo. I grabbed my pack, GPS unit and camera and headed up the trail. The weather was overcast, spitting rain occasionally but nothing serious. I'd worn my rain shell and was comfortable enough. The trail climbed steadily for about 2 kilometers, then leveled out onto a ridge. The trees thinned slightly, and I could see down into the valley below, just more forest, gray-green and endless. I stopped to drink water and check the GPS. According to the map, there was a creek crossing about half a kilometer ahead. I found the creek without trouble. It was running high from recent rain, maybe 3 meters wide, with a log bridge that looked newer than the surrounding forest. I crossed carefully, checking the stability, and made a note that it seemed solid. On the far side, the trail narrowed. The forest felt denser here, the trees pressing in close, branches meeting overhead to form a tunnel. The light took on a greenish quality, filtered through layers of moss and needles. It was the kind of place that felt old, untouched. I walked for another 20 minutes before I noticed something off about the trail. The markers, small plastic rectangles nailed to trees at regular intervals, had stopped. I checked the GPS, and according to it, I was still on the trail, but I couldn't see any markers. I backtracked 50 meters, found the last marker, then walked forward again, going slower this time. The trail continued, clear enough to follow, but the markers were just gone. Like someone had removed them. That's when I saw the cairn. It was off to the side of the trail, maybe 3 meters into the trees. A stack of rocks, waist-high, deliberately arranged. The stones were smooth river rocks, which was strange because the creek was half a kilometer back, and I hadn't seen any stones like that along the trail. I stopped and stared at it. Cairns weren't unusual in the backcountry, hikers built them as landmarks, but this one felt wrong. The stones were too perfectly balanced, stacked in a way that seemed impossible without mortar. I took a photo for the report and kept walking. The trail began to descend, dropping down into a small hollow. The trees here were enormous, cedars with trunks so wide I couldn't have wrapped my arms around them. The air was cooler, damper, and I could hear water somewhere nearby, a faint trickling sound. That's when I noticed I was walking on something other than dirt. I stopped and looked down. The trail was covered in a layer of pine needles, but underneath I could feel something solid. I brushed the needles away with my boot and saw stone. Flat, gray stone fitted together like pavers. A path. Someone had built a stone path here in the middle of nowhere, and the forest had grown over it. I followed it for another 100 meters, brushing needles aside every few steps to confirm the stones were still there. The path curved gently to the left and then opened into a clearing. And in the center of the clearing was a house, not a cabin, a house. 2 stories, wood siding with a peaked roof and a front porch. It looked like something you'd see in a small town, picked up and dropped into the forest. The siding was weathered gray, and the windows were empty, no glass, just dark openings, but the structure was intact. No collapse, no obvious decay. I stood at the edge of the clearing, staring. The house didn't make sense. We were kilometers from the nearest road, in terrain that would make construction nearly impossible, and the maps had shown nothing but forest in this area. I walked closer, moving carefully, like I was approaching a sleeping animal. The front door was ajar, hanging slightly crooked on its hinges. I stopped at the porch steps and called out, "Hello." My voice sounded flat, swallowed by the trees. No echo, no response. I climbed the steps, they creaked but held, and pushed the door open wider. Inside was a single large room, empty except for a few pieces of broken furniture, a table on its side, a chair with two legs missing. The floor was covered in leaves and debris, but the walls were what made me stop breathing. They were covered in marks, not graffiti, marks. Deep gouges in the wood, running floor to ceiling, hundreds of them. Some were straight lines, some were curved. They overlapped and crossed, creating patterns that hurt to look at, like they were pulling my eyes in directions they didn't want to go. I backed out of the house and stood on the porch, my heart pounding. I pulled out my camera and took photos of the exterior, then the interior through the doorway. I didn't want to go back inside. As I was lowering the camera, I heard something. A sound like wood sliding against wood coming from the second floor. I looked up at the windows. They were dark, empty, but I had the overwhelming feeling that something was looking back down at me. I left the porch and walked quickly back toward the stone path. Behind me, I heard the sound again, louder this time, like furniture being dragged across a floor. I didn't run, not yet. But I walked fast, following the path back the way I'd come, my breathing loud in my ears. When I reached the cairn, I stopped and looked back. The house was still visible through the trees, and standing on the porch perfectly still was a figure. It was tall, too tall, and it was facing me, though I couldn't see any features, just a dark shape against the darker doorway. That's when I ran. I followed the trail back to the creek, my pack bouncing against my back, branches slapping my face. I didn't stop until I reached the log bridge, and even then I only paused long enough to look behind me. Nothing, the trail was empty. I crossed the bridge and kept moving, not slowing down until I saw Raquel and Owen through the trees. When I reached them, I was breathing so hard I couldn't speak for a minute. "What happened?" Raquel asked, grabbing my shoulder. I told them. The stone path, the house, the marks on the walls, the figure on the porch. Owen's face went pale. "You saw the house?" He said, "You know about it." He looked at Raquel, who nodded slowly. "It's in the old reports," she said, "from the 1970s. A survey crew found it and reported it to Parks. But when they sent people back to investigate, they couldn't find it. No house. No stone path, nothing." "I have photos," I said, pulling out my camera. I turned on the display and scrolled to the images. The first few showed the trail, the cairn, the forest. But when I reached the photos of the house, the screen showed only darkness. Not blurry images, not corrupted files, just pure black, like I'd taken pictures with the lens cap on. Every photo of the house was gone. We went back to the truck and I didn't return to that section of trail. Raquel reassigned me to a different area and I finished the season without incident. But a month later, Owen quit. He didn't say why, but Raquel told me he'd gone back to the hollow, alone, to see if the house was still there. They found his truck at the trailhead 2 days later. His pack and GPS were inside, but Owen was gone. Search and rescue spent a week combing the area. They never found him. I think about that house sometimes, about the marks on the walls and the figure on the porch, about how the stone path was built by someone a long time ago, leading to a place that shouldn't exist. And I think about Owen and whether he found what he was looking for. The story 4. Îles is a small island in the St. Lawrence River, about an hour northeast of Quebec City. You reach it by ferry, a 15-minute crossing that feels longer in winter when the ice floes drift past and the wind cuts through your coat. The island has maybe 1,200 permanent residents, most of them descendants of the original French settlers who arrived in the 1600s. My name is Claire Beaumont, and I spent a winter there in 2023, renting a cottage on the eastern shore while I worked on my thesis. I was in my second year of a graduate program in folklore studies at Université Laval, and my research focused on oral traditions in isolated communities. Ilok Scouters was perfect, small enough that everyone knew everyone, old enough that stories had been passed down through generations. The cottage belonged to a woman named Marguerite, who lived in the main house, about 50 meters up the hill. She was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and direct, and she spoke Québécois French so thick I sometimes had to ask her to repeat herself. She told me the cottage had been her son's before he moved to Montreal. He didn't like the winters, she said, too quiet for him. I liked the quiet. The cottage sat at the edge of a rocky beach, with the river stretching out grey and cold under the November sky. At night, I could hear the water moving against the stones, a constant low rhythm that helped me sleep. I settled into a routine. Mornings, I'd work on my thesis. Afternoons, I'd walk the island, visiting the handful of elderly residents Marguerite had introduced me to, recording their stories. Most were about the island's history, shipwrecks, harsh winters, family feuds that had lasted generations. But there was one story no one wanted to tell me. I first heard it mentioned by a man named Philippe, who ran the island's only gas station. I'd asked him if there were any local legends, anything about ghosts or strange occurrences. He'd shaken his head. "Not really," he said. "People here don't talk about that stuff much." But then, as I was leaving, he called after me. "You hear anything at night from the river, you just ignore it. Okay." What would I hear? He didn't answer, just turned back to his work. I asked Marguerite about it that evening. She was making tourtière in her kitchen, and I'd stopped by to drop off rent. When I repeated what Philippe had said, she went very still. "He shouldn't have said anything," she muttered. "Said anything about what?" She was quiet for a long time, rolling dough with more force than necessary. Finally, she sighed. "Les voix, the voices. Some people hear them in the winter. From the river, it's nothing, just the wind and the ice." "What do they say?" "Nothing, because they're not real." She looked at me sharply. "You're a smart girl, Claire. You don't believe in ghost stories." But the way she said it, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me, made my skin prickle. I heard them for the first time on a Monday night in early December. I'd gone to bed around 11, and I was just drifting off when I heard voices outside. Faint at first, like people talking at a distance. I sat up, listening. The voices were coming from the direction of the river, rising and falling with the wind. I got out of bed and went to the window. The beach was empty, just dark shapes of rocks and the faint glimmer of ice forming along the shore. But I could still hear the voices, multiple people speaking in French, though I couldn't make out words. I told myself it was sound carrying across the water from the mainland, or maybe someone was out on the ice, though that seemed unlikely at this hour. I went back to bed and eventually fell asleep. The next night, I heard them again. This time I was still awake, reading in bed when the voices started. They were clearer now. I could pick out individual words, fragments that didn't quite form sentences, and they sounded close, like people standing just outside the cottage. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the door, opening it carefully. Cold air rushed in, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I shone the flashlight across the beach. Nothing. The voices had stopped the moment I opened the door. I stood there for a full minute, shivering, then went back inside and locked the door. I didn't sleep well that night. The pattern continued for a week. Every night, the voices, always after dark, always from the direction of the river, and always stopping the moment I tried to investigate. I started keeping a notebook, writing down what I heard. Most of it was too fragmented to understand. But some phrases came through clearly. Ni pas pa, don't leaves. Orevians, come back. Aid nows, help us. I showed the notebook to Marguerite. She read through it, her expression hardening with each page. You need to stop listening, she said. What are they? They're nothing, tricks of the wind. You know that's not true. She slammed the notebook down on the table. What do you want me to say? That people hear voices from the river in winter? That sometimes those voices sound like people you know? That if you listen too long, you might hear your own voice calling? I stared at her. What? She looked away. My husband heard them, the winter before he died. He told me he heard his own voice calling to him from the ice, telling him to come closer. What happened? He stayed inside. He ignored them and they went away. She looked back at me, her eyes hard. You need to do the same. I tried. I wore earplugs at night, played music to cover the sounds. But I could still hear them, faint and insistent, underneath everything else. And then, 2 weeks before Christmas, I heard my name. It was just after midnight. I was lying in bed, earplugs in, eyes closed, trying to sleep. And I heard it, clear as day, cutting through the foam and music. Cleo. My voice, my exact voice, the way it sounded when I heard recordings of myself, calling from the river. I sat up, my heart racing. The voice came again. Clea Veen's ice. Come here. I pulled out the earplugs. The voice was louder now, unmistakable. My own voice, speaking French with my accent, calling me to come outside. I got out of bed and went to the window. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows on the snow-covered beach. And standing at the edge of the ice, maybe 20 meters from the cottage, was a figure. It looked like me. Same height, same build, same coat I'd worn earlier that day. It was facing the river, but as I watched, it turned slowly to look at the cottage, at the window, at me, and it smiled. I backed away from the window so fast I tripped over the bed frame and fell. I scrambled to the door and checked the lock. It was bolted, then grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial. Marguerite answered on the third ring. Clea. There's someone outside. They look like me. Silence, then, don't go out. Do you understand? No matter what you hear, don't go outside. What is it? It's what takes people, she said quietly. In winter, when the ice is thin, it calls them out and they walk onto the river and they fall through. We find them in the spring. I spent the rest of the night huddled in bed, lights on, listening to my own voice calling from outside. It went on for hours, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes just repeating my name over and over. When dawn finally came, the voice stopped. I looked out the window. The beach was empty, but in the snow, leading from the cottage to the edge of the ice, were footprints. My footprints, my boot treads, the same pattern as the boots sitting by my door. I left the island that afternoon. Marguerite didn't try to talk me out of it. She helped me pack and drove me to the ferry herself. I'm sorry, she said as we waited for the boat. I should have warned you better." "What is it?" I asked. "Really?" She shook her head. "My grandmother said it's the river, that it's lonely in winter, that it calls people to keep it company." She looked out at the gray water, the ice forming in jagged patterns along the shore. "I don't know if that's true, but I know people disappear, and I know it's better not to listen." I never finished my thesis. I changed my focus to something safer, something that didn't involve isolated islands and winter voices. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I hear my name being called. Just once, faint and distant. And I never answer. The story 5. Manning, Alberta is barely a town, more of a junction really, where two highways meet in the middle of boreal forest. Population around 1,100. I'm Tyler Brennan, and I moved there in 2022 to work as a paramedic for the Regional Health Authority. The job covered a huge area, responding to calls from farms, logging camps, and First Nations communities scattered across hundreds of square kilometers. In February of 2024, we got a call at 2 a.m. A man at a hunting camp about 80 kilometers north of town reporting chest pains. I went with my partner Natasha in the ambulance. The roads were clear enough, but it was cold, -30 with wind chill and the forest pressed in close on both sides of the highway. The camp wasn't hard to find. It was a cluster of cabins along a lake, used mostly during hunting season, but with a few year-round residents who preferred the isolation. We pulled up to the address and grabbed our gear. The man who met us at the door was in his 50s, pale and sweating. He was clutching his chest, but when Natasha checked his vitals, everything came back normal. No heart attack, probably a panic attack or anxiety. We spent 20 minutes making sure he was stable, gave him some information, and told him to follow up with his doctor. As we were packing up to leave, he grabbed my arm. "You're driving back tonight." "Yes, why?" He looked past me, out the window to where the ambulance was parked. "Be careful on the road. There's been people have seen things." "What kind of things?" He hesitated. "Animals, I guess, but wrong. You'll know if you see it." I thanked him and headed back to the ambulance. Natasha was already in the driver's seat, engine running. As I climbed in, I glanced back at the cabin. The man was still standing in the doorway, watching us. The drive back started fine. The road was empty, as expected at 3 a.m., and the ambulance's headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness. Natasha was quiet, focused on driving, and I was half asleep in the passenger seat. We'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes when something ran across the road ahead of us. Natasha hit the brakes, and we skidded slightly before stopping. "What the hell was that?" she said. I'd only caught a glimpse, something large moving fast. Moose, maybe. Didn't move like a moose. We sat there for a moment, staring at the empty road. Whatever it was had disappeared into the trees on the far side. Natasha put the ambulance in gear, and we continued, both of us more awake now. 5 minutes later, it happened again. This time I saw it more clearly. It came from the left side of the road, loping across in front of us on 4 legs. But the legs were too long, and the body was too thin, and the way it moved was wrong, joints bending in ways that didn't match any animal I knew. Natasha slammed the brakes again. "Jesus Christ, what is that?" It stopped on the right side of the road, just at the edge of the headlights, and turned to look at us. That's when I realized it didn't have a proper head, just a smooth, elongated shape where a head should be, no eyes or mouth that I could see. We stared at it. It stared back. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. "We need to go," I said. "Now." Natasha didn't argue. She accelerated and we drove faster than we should have on icy roads, both of us gripping our seats. For 10 minutes nothing happened. I started to think we'd left it behind. Then I saw movement in the rearview mirror. Something was running behind us. It was keeping pace with the ambulance, staying just at the edge of the light from our taillights, running on 4 legs but too fast, too smooth. I watched it in the mirror, my mouth dry. "It's following us," I said. Natasha glanced at the mirror, then pressed the accelerator harder. The ambulance's engine whined as we picked up speed. 70 kilometers an hour, 80, 90. The thing kept pace. "How is it doing that?" Natasha's voice was tight. "I don't know." We were flying down the highway now, the forest blurring past. I kept my eyes on the mirror. The thing was closer now, its shape more defined. I could see the way its legs moved, too many joints, bending in impossible ways. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Just stopped running and stood in the middle of the road, shrinking in the distance as we sped away. We didn't slow down until we hit the outskirts of Manning. Natasha pulled into the ambulance bay and killed the engine, and we both sat there, breathing hard. "We're not reporting this," she said finally. "No. People will think we're insane." "Yeah." We went inside, filed the paperwork for the call, and went home. Neither of us mentioned what we'd seen, but 3 days later, Natasha called me. "I need to show you something." We met at a coffee shop, and she pulled out her phone. "I went back," she said, "during the day to where we saw it." She showed me a photo. It was the highway covered in snow, and in the snow running parallel to the road were tracks, not moose tracks, not bear tracks. They were too large, too spread out, and they showed joints where no animal's legs should bend. The tracks ran for at least a kilometer based on the photos she'd taken, and at one point they crossed the road right where the thing had stopped and watched us drive away. "What do we do?" I asked. "Nothing," Natasha said. "We don't go back up that road at night, and we don't tell anyone." I agreed, but I still think about it, about the way it moved, the way it kept pace with us, even at 90 kilometers an hour, about the tracks Natasha found and the way they just stopped, like whatever made them had simply vanished. And sometimes, when I'm driving at night and I see movement at the edge of the headlights, my hands tighten on the wheel and I drive a little faster, just in case. A story 6. Fogo Island sits off the northeast coast of Newfoundland, about 25 kilometers from the nearest point on the mainland. It's rocky, windswept, beautiful in a harsh way. The communities on the island, places like Tilting and Joe Bat's Arm, are small, maybe a few hundred people each, hanging on through fishing and tourism. My name is Hannah Oates, and I went to Fogo Island in September of 2023 for an artist residency. I'm a painter, and the residency offered a month-long stay in a studio overlooking the Atlantic. The idea was to work in isolation, let the landscape inspire new pieces. It sounded perfect. The studio was in a converted fishing shed on the outskirts of Tilting, perched on the rocks with waves crashing below. Inside was a bed, a small kitchen, and a large open space with north-facing windows. The light was incredible, sharp and clear, even on overcast days. I spent the first week settling in, doing preliminary sketches, getting used to the rhythm of the place. The locals were friendly but distant, which I appreciated. I wasn't there to socialize, I was there to work. The first strange thing happened during my second week. I'd been painting late into the evening, losing track of time the way I do when I'm focused. When I finally looked up, it was past midnight. I stretched, made tea, and went to the window to look out at the ocean. And I saw a light, It was out on the water, maybe half a kilometer offshore. A single point of light, steady and bright like a lantern. I watched it for a minute, assuming it was a fishing boat, but it didn't move, and there was no sound of an engine. I watched for 10 more minutes. The light stayed in place. Then suddenly it went out. I waited, but it didn't come back. I went to bed telling myself it had been a boat, even though I knew boats didn't just sit still without lights on. I saw the light again 3 nights later. Same place, same steady glow. This time I grabbed binoculars and tried to get a better look, but the distance and darkness made it impossible to see details. Just the light hovering above the water. I mentioned it to a woman named Bridget who ran the small grocery store in Tilting. Probably a boat, she said, not meeting my eyes. It wasn't moving. Fishermen anchor sometimes, check nets. But the way she said it, quick and dismissive, made me think she knew more than she was saying. That night I stayed up specifically to watch for the light. It appeared around 11 p.m. in the same spot as before. I stared at it through the binoculars, trying to understand what I was seeing. The light was too steady to be a lantern swaying on a boat, and there was no structure beneath it, no boat, no buoy, just light. And then it moved, not across the water, toward the shore. Straight toward my studio. I lowered the binoculars, my heart racing. The light continued moving, faster now, gliding across the water without sound. It was coming directly at me, and I had the sudden, overwhelming urge to turn off the studio lights to hide. I killed the lights and pressed myself against the wall beside the window, watching. The light came closer, closer, until it was just offshore, maybe 50 meters from the rocks below. And then it stopped. I held my breath, not daring to move. The light hung there, illuminating the water beneath it. And in that light I saw something, shapes, moving in the water. Too large to be fish, too many to count. They circled beneath the light, rising and falling, and I realized they were looking up, watching the light or watching me. The light stayed for maybe 5 minutes. Then it moved again, this time parallel to the shore, drifting north. The shapes in the water followed it. I watched until the light disappeared around a headland and the ocean returned to darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the window watching, but the light didn't come back. The next morning I walked into Tilting and found Bridget at the store. "I need to know what the light is," I said. She looked at me for a long moment, then sighed. "Come on." She locked up the store and drove me to the north end of the island, to a small cemetery overlooking the ocean. We stood at the edge, wind whipping our hair, and she pointed out to sea. "Fishermen have been seeing that light for as long as anyone can remember," she said. "Some people say it's a ghost ship. Some say it's something older. My grandfather said it was calling to the things in the water." "What things?" "I don't know, things that don't belong, things that shouldn't be." She looked at me. "You saw them, didn't you, under the lights?" I nodded. "Then you know enough. My advice, don't watch for it anymore. It doesn't like being watched." I went back to the studio and tried to focus on my work. But that night, the light appeared again. And this time, when it moved toward the shore, I didn't hide. I stood at the window and watched it approach. The shapes in the water followed, circling, rising closer to the surface. And as the light came within 30 meters of the rocks, I saw one of the shapes breach. It was pale, human-sized, but wrong. The proportions were off, limbs too long, torso too narrow. It surfaced for just a moment, then slipped back under. The light stopped moving, and I felt with absolute certainty that it was waiting, that it wanted me to come closer. To go down to the rocks, to step into the water. I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone. I called Bridget. "It's here," I said. "What do I do?" "Stay inside. Don't go to the water. It'll lave." How do you know? Because if it could come onto land, it already would have. I stayed inside, lights off, huddled in the corner farthest from the window. The light remained for over an hour. I could see its glow reflecting off the walls, pulsing slowly. And I could hear sounds from the water, wet, dragging sounds, like something trying to pull itself onto the rocks. Finally, just before dawn, the light moved away. I waited until full daylight before going to the window. The rocks below were covered in something, not seaweed, not kelp, long, pale strands that looked almost like hair draped across the stones and dripping into the water. I left Fogo Island that afternoon. I told the residency coordinators I had a family emergency. They refunded part of my fee, and I took the ferry back to the mainland. But before I left, I went back to the studio one last time to pack my things, and I found something I hadn't left there, a small piece of driftwood on the windowsill, worn smooth by water. Someone or something had carved a symbol into it, a circle with lines radiating outward like a light. A Story 7. Weyaquin is a tiny community in northern Saskatchewan, sitting on the edge of the boreal forest where the trees start to thin out and give way to Muskegon lakes. I'm not sure you'd even call it a town, maybe 20 permanent residents, a cluster of cabins, and a lot of wilderness. My name is Marcus Reyes, and I went to Weyaquin in August of 2024 as part of a wildlife biology survey. I was working on a project studying lynx populations, which meant setting up camera traps in the forest and checking them every few weeks. It was solitary work, which I preferred. I'd always been better with animals than people. The first 2 weeks were routine. I set up 15 cameras along game trails and near kill sites, marking GPS coordinates and checking them every 3 days. The data was good. We were getting clear images of lynx, foxes, even a wolverine, which was rare. On my third check, I found something odd on one of the cameras. The camera was positioned on a trail that ran through dense spruce, about 7 kilometers from where I was camping. When I reviewed the footage, most of it was normal. A lynx passing through at dawn, a few birds, some caribou. But there was one clip, time-stamped at 3:17 a.m. that made me stop. It showed a figure, not an animal, a person standing in the middle of the trail facing the camera. They were maybe 15 meters away, barely visible in the infrared glow. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like dark clothing. They stood perfectly still for 30 seconds, then walked off trail into the forest. I replayed the clip 3 times. The figure moved strangely, too smooth, too fluid, like they were gliding instead of walking. And when they turned to leave, I saw their profile. The head was wrong, too elongated, no clear features. I told myself it was a person, someone else camping in the area. But this far out, that was unlikely. And the way they moved didn't sit right. I checked the other cameras, nothing unusual. 3 days later, I went back to the same trail to swap the memory card. The camera was still in place, but when I reviewed the new footage, there were 6 more clips of the figure. Different times, 1:45 a.m., 2:30 a.m., 4:00 a.m. Always standing in the same spot, facing the camera, never moving except to walk off into the forest. And in each clip, they were closer. By the 6th clip, they were less than 5 meters from the camera, close enough that I could see details. And that's when I realized it wasn't wearing clothes. What I'd thought was dark clothing was skin, smooth, dark skin, almost black, and the head wasn't elongated because of a hood or hat. That was its actual shape. I pulled the camera down. I didn't care about the data anymore. I packed it into my backpack and started the hike back to my truck, almost 3 kilometers away. I'd walked maybe half that distance when I heard something behind me. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, matching my pace, I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I turned around. The trail behind me was empty. I started walking again, faster now. The footsteps resumed, closer this time. I could hear branches snapping, the crunch of needles under weight. I didn't turn around. I just walked, gripping my bear spray, trying to stay calm. The truck was a kilometer away. I could make it. The footsteps stopped again. And then I heard something else. A sound like wood scraping against wood, rhythmic and slow. It was coming from the trees to my left, maybe 20 meters off the trail. I made the mistake of looking. There was something standing between the trees, tall, impossibly thin, with arms that hung below its knees. Its skin was smooth and black, and its head was elongated, featureless. It was standing sideways to me, but I had the feeling it was watching, that it didn't need eyes to see. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I didn't stop until I reached the truck. I threw my gear in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine started. I threw the truck into gear and floored it, gravel spraying as I tore out of the parking area and onto the dirt road. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if it was following. When I got back to Weaquin, I went straight to the lodge where I'd been staying and told the owner, a man named Edward, what I'd seen. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You saw the walker." "The what?" "That's what people call it. Been around longer than the town, longer than the reserve. My grandfather said his grandfather knew about it." "What is it?" Edward shrugged. "Nobody knows, but it doesn't hurt people as far as I know. It just watches, follows. People see it out in the bush sometimes. Most of them know to leave it alone." "It was getting closer every night," I said, "on the camera." "Then you did the right thing, leaving." I asked if anyone had ever tried to study it, to figure out what it was. Edward shook his head. "People who try to get too close don't always come back, or they come back different." I left Weaquin the next day. I turned in my resignation to the university and told them I was done with fieldwork. They asked why, and I told them personal reasons. But I kept the camera, and sometimes, late at night, I review the footage. The 6 clips of the figure getting closer and closer. In the final clip, it's close enough that I can see its hand reaching toward the camera, fingers too long and thin to be human. And in the last frame, just before it walks away, I swear it tilts its head, like it knows I'm watching, like it's waiting for me to come back. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.